Hey and welcome gurus to this demo lesson, create and configure an Azure Load Balancer. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this lesson that we're going to use a case study scenario to help us understand how to create and configure an Azure Load Balancer. We'll do this inside of the Azure Cloud Sandbox, and then we'll cover the demonstration steps that we're going to go through in this demo lesson, and then we'll bring it back to the slides for some key takeaways. So to start off, our Control-Alt-Suite's organization inside of our Azure Cloud Sandbox is going to have a hub virtual network that we've grown familiar with. In this virtual network, we're going to have a subnet with two virtual machines, and this is what is going to be created by our deployment when we're setting up. As always, the resources for setting up the demonstration is available in the resources of this lesson. Now, the demonstration steps we're going to go through are implementing our public load balancer, where we're going to create a standard SKU load balancer. We're going to configure those VMs as part of the backend pool. We'll create a load balancing rule for HTTP, and then we're going to configure a NAT rule for SSH to a VM in our backend pool. And then we'll review outbound rules, and we'll configure a backend pool to use public IP for IP masquerading, and then we'll validate that all of these rules work correctly. All right, gurus, enough of our demonstration steps. Let's make our way into the Azure portal and get started. All right, gurus, here we are in the Azure portal, and we're going to get started by using the resources file provided with this lesson to get the commands we need. We'll copy and paste these commands, and we'll bring these over into our Cloud Shell. If you haven't set up your Cloud Shell, please do it this time so that you can paste in those commands. And this is going to pull down the file and start setting up the deployment for this demo. And we're going to provide some information here to this deployment. We're going to give a username for our virtual machines. You provide whatever username you'd like, and then your password. Once you pass in your password, you can hit enter. And then it's going to go off and run this deployment. So we'll be back once this is done and it's finished setting up all of the resources for this load balancer demo. All right, gurus, so after about 10 to 15 minutes and some movie magic, we fast forwarded to when our resources have finished deploying, as we see by our succeeded message here for the provisioning state of this deployment. We'll minimize our Cloud Shell here, and if you haven't already, go ahead and refresh so that you can see all the resources inside of your resource group. If I bring up this drop down there, and then I see all my resources here, I have my Bastion, the Bastion public IP, a network security group allowing SSH and HTTP traffic into the subnet that is inside of my virtual network, this hub VNet that contains my two virtual machines here, hub VM1 and hub VM2, which are both inside of that subnet. Now, what we're going to do at this point is create our public load balancer. So we'll come up to the search bar here, and we'll type in load balancing. And what we'll see is load balancing, help me choose. We'll click on this here, and this gives us all of our options, trying to figure out what type of load balancing solution we need. We can always come here, and it will give us a little bit of information about each. We're going to create the load balancer for Azure Load Balancer. So we'll click create here, and this is going to bring us into the provisioning process for our load balancer. We'll select our resource group. We're going to give this a name here. We're going to call this our ACG Demo LB01, and we're going to let it be inside of the same region as this virtual network. And we can check this by right-clicking on our tab here, clicking duplicate, and if we make our way over to our virtual network inside of the dashboard, what we'll see is that all these resources are in EastUS, so we'll run with EastUS for this deployment here. Now we get to choose our SKU, and we can choose between standard or basic. Standard is going to be more secure because it's going to use a standard SKU public IP, so it's going to be secure by default. And basic is going to be insecure by default, so it will need an NSG to secure that traffic. As well, we've already learned the differences between these SKUs, and that standard provides the ability to use up to 1,000 instances in the back end, and basic gives us that 300. So we're going to run with standard here. And then for our type, we're going to use public. This is where we could choose public or internal if it was just going to be private traffic that we were balancing. In our example, we're going to use public. And tier is where we can select whether or not this is going to be a regional or a global deployment. If it were a global deployment, it would deploy it to a home region, and we could use this to balance between other Azure load balancers. And we'll learn more about that later, but for now, we're going to deploy it regionally to our EastUS region. And then we're going to click next into the front-end IP configuration. Here's where we can add a front-end IP config. We'll click add here, and we're going to give this a name. We're going to call this our ACG demo LB IP config, and it's going to be IPv4. We're going to use an IP address, but we could also use an IP prefix here. We're going to create a new public IP address for this resource, and we're going to call this our ACG demo LB -pip. And we see it's a standard regional static assignment public load balancer. We could also choose to make it zone redundant or a specific zone or no zone. We're going to run with the default settings, click OK here, and then we're going to click add, and this is going to move us into the next configuration detail, our backend pools here. We're going to add our backend pools of our VMs, so we'll call this our VMBE pool, and we'll select our virtual network here. And this is the reason we had to make sure it was inside of the same region, because the load balancer will only work with a virtual network in the same region. We'll select it here, and we can choose the backend pool configuration of either the NIC or the IP address. And what we're going to use is NIC IPv4. We'll click add for our virtual machines here. We'll add our 2 virtual machines, click add, and now we see they've both been added here to the backend pool. We could also have used virtual machine scale sets, and again, they also have to be in the same location as the load balancer, but we don't have any. We just have these VMs here, so we'll click add, and then we'll move into our inbound rules. Now for our inbound rules here in an Azure load balancer, we have load balancing rules, which is going to be our HTTP rule for balancing that traffic, and then our NAT rule. So let's add a load balancing rule here. We'll click add. We're going to call this our LB rule, and then we're going to give the front-end IP config that we want to use here. We're going to select the one that is to be created on this deployment. We'll select our backend pool, our VMBE pool here, and then we'll specify the protocol, be that TCP or UDP. Again, this is a layer 4 load balancing solution, so these are the only 2 options we have here. We'll specify our port. We're going to use port 80, and then we're going to map that to the backend port of 80. So it'll be the front end port 80 for the public load balancer, and then that'll map to the backend port of the solutions running our BE pool where we have the VMs. So it'll map it to port 80. Then we're going to have a health probe here. We'll click create a new health probe. We'll call this our health probe. We'll select the protocol here. We'll use TCP, port 80, and here's where we can set the interval of how frequently we want to check it. And after 2 unhealthy checks, we have 2 consecutive failures. Let us know it's unhealthy is basically what we're saying here. We'll click OK. And here's where we can also set our session persistence. This is what we were talking about with that 5-tuple hash, where we can say, hey, we want to have no session persistence whatsoever, so that every time you connect, you get a session to a different resource, potentially client IP, or we want to use client IP and protocol to establish our session persistence. And that's all the information from that 5-tuple hash that we're using that we talked about in a previous lesson. We're going to go ahead and say none so that we can see it balancing between the 2. And for TCP reset, we'll leave it as it is by default. Floating IP, we'll leave it as it is by default as well. And for our outbound source network address translation, which is going to be our outbound rule we'll use for IP masquerading, we're going to use outbound rules specifically to provide back and pool members access to the internet. So we'll go ahead and click add here, and then we're going to add our NAT rule. We'll click add NAT rule here. We'll call this our SSH rule. And then for the type here, we could select a specific virtual machine or a backend pool as a whole. And if we use the backend pool as a whole, we would select the backend pool. And then we would say what front end we want to use. That would be the public IP of our Azure load balancer. And then the starting port range for the front end. And we would then say the maximum number of machines in the backend pool and the backend port we're mapping that traffic to. But we're going to use a specific Azure virtual machine here. We'll select our hub VM1. And for the network IP configuration, we'll click IP config 1. This will be pre-populated because we selected this VM here. For the front-end IP, we're going to use the Azure Load Balancer's public IP address. For the front-end port, we're going to use 22. The service tag is going to be SSH, and the backend port, 22 as well. Protocol, TCP. We'll accept the default for the rest of the settings and click Add here. And then we'll move into our outbound rule here. And this is where we're going to configure that IP masquerading so that we are making sure it gets the IP of our Azure Load Balancer in the return traffic. So we'll click Add an outbound rule here, and we're going to call this our out rule we'll leave it for IPv4. The front-end IP address is going to be that of our public load balancer here. For all traffic, we'll leave it as by default, but we could do TCP or UDP. And then we're going to choose our backend pool, the VMBE pool here. And then for the port allocation, what we're doing here is selecting which ports we want to use for that outbound traffic. So we can use the default number of outbound ports, or we can manually choose the number of outbound ports to use here. So if we were to manually choose, we'd say, hey, we want to use this many ports per instance, and we would select how many ports we want to use. Maybe we want to split it. Maybe we want to say we'll use 10,000 per instance, and that means we can have 6 instances in the backend pool. If we use 1,000, we can have 63. And so something you have to keep in mind here is port exhaustion. You want to make sure that you have enough ports for outbound traffic to satisfy all of those resources running in your backend here. So in our case, we'll just say we want to use 500 for each, and that means that we could have up to 127. And actually we see here it's telling us that it has to be something that is divisible by 8. So we'll just go ahead and run with 2400 here. That'll give us the ability to have 26 in the back end, and then we'll click add. And now we have that rule set up. If we click into this rule here and we go back, we see we could also choose the maximum number of backend instances we wanted to have and do it in the reverse direction. But we'll go ahead and click cancel here. We'll move into review and create for our resource here. And once it validates the deployment, we'll click create, and we'll be back as soon as this resource has finished provisioning. All right, Gurus, we're back, and the deployment of our resource has finished. So we'll go into our Azure Load Balancer here, and right away, we'll go to our front-end IP config here, and we're going to start validating all those rules created. First, we'll validate the load balancing rule. We'll go ahead and copy this public IP address, paste it into our browser here, hit enter, and we see it's balanced our traffic to our hub VM2. If we were to open this up in another browser session and make another request, it would balance it potentially to VM01 because we have the session persistence set to none. We'll X out of this. And next, we're going to validate that inbound NAT rule. So what we're going to do is open up our Cloud Shell here. If you need to restart your Cloud Shell, make sure to click here. We're going to type SSH, our username, at the public IP address, hit enter. It's going to ask us to accept that fingerprint. We'll say yes. We'll type in our password here. We'll hit enter. And what we see is we are inside of our VM, as we can validate here by its private IP. We'll clear up this here, and now we're going to test that outbound rule. And I'm going to do this by copying a command off screen. I'm going to provide the link to this in the resources of this lesson. And what we see is it is checking the public IP, and our outbound public IP matches that of our Azure Load Balancer. So we validated that our out rule, our SSH rule, which is our NAT rule, and our load balancing rule all work correctly. All right, Gurus, that concludes this demo. Let's make our way back to the slides for a quick review. All right, Gurus, congratulations on following along in the demonstration. The things we want to take away from this lesson are that we understand what Azure Load Balancer is for. Using Azure Load Balancer, we can balance public traffic, and what we're talking about is traffic from the internet, like we did with our load balancing rule in our demo. And we can configure public load balancers with virtual machines or virtual machine scale sets for the backend pool. We can also do the same thing with private traffic. We can load balance that private traffic inside of our networks and use VMs and VM scale sets for the backend pool of private Azure load balancers. We also saw that we have types of rules that we can use. We have our inbound and outbound NAT rules, as we saw whenever we were using our NAT and our SNAT rules. We have our load balancing rules, and additionally, if we want to provide a highly available load balancing solution, we can use HA port rules, which we talked about in a previous lesson. We didn't cover it in this demo, but it allows us to open up all ports for load balancing on our Azure Load Balancer. All right, Gurus, that is all my time for now. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.